All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our study of the divided kingdom. We're glad to be back after having to take a week off because of the weather. We missed everyone. We're glad to see everyone back. So by way of review, last lesson we talked about the progression of the kings from the split, right? So we had been in the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and then we went through this time of, we called it decline, but there was some of each, right? And into the time of intense prophetic activity that we're starting today with the story of Elijah and Ahab. So let's kind of look at what happened in each kingdom. Remember how the narrative really switches between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. We have to kind of orient ourselves every time we have a big switch. So what happened in the southern kingdom of Judah, right? We started with Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. And how did he do as king?
Not very well.
Right. Right. And then he was worse than Solomon, they said. And it says, the text really makes a point to say there were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. And we talked about what that meant and how that was part of the worship of these Canaanite gods, right? How did Rehoboam's son do? So you can look back.
Not any better, right?
No, not any better. This was Abijam, or sometimes some translations will translate that Abijah. This is the beginning of chapter 15, and he continued the practices that had gone downhill, right? But then we come to 15:9 and we get Asa. And how did Asa do?
He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord.
Right, he was much better. We have a strong sense of improvement. It says he didn't remove the high places. So our translation takeaway from that is that the way is open for the people to slip back into old habits. However, he did remove some of these idols, right? And he got rid of the shrine prostitutes, and that was very good. And our prophetic narrator clearly approves of that, right? When our prophetic narrator doesn't give us the story of all of the kingly things the king did. It's all about whether they walked in the ways of the Lord. Here we go. Okay, so we saw that Asa suffered from the consequences of the generational sin that he inherited. However, even though he did well, he went through warfare with Israel, a result of these previous generations of sin. He lost territory, even though, he used this sort of gambit with Ben-Hadad, this neighboring king, and said, stop fighting for Israel and start fighting against Israel for me. Well, that worked for him in that they did not overwhelm his territory, but there was a loss of territory to Ben-Hadad for the people of Israel overall, right? And they had that loss of the valuables from the temple. So we talked about how they went from the golden age of Solomon to the rather grubbier Bronze Age. Like that happened. Oh, that was the commentary that I thought was cute. But that happened over that reign. Okay, so that's our sense of what's been going on in the southern kingdom. And Asa reigned for a very long time. And over that time, we go back to Israel and we see the sequence of kings that all happened during Asa's reign as well. So someone tell us what happened in the northern kingdom.
This is Jeroboam, right?
Yes, they started out with Jeroboam, and how was he?
Okay, he built the 2 golden calves and chose the low priests, so not good.
Not good, right? The sin of Jeroboam that he caused Israel to sin becomes a refrain that's repeated over and over in these throughout the northern kings, right? And then what was spoken against his altar and then later his household?
That all his family would be, all his lineage would be destroyed, because at the altar his hand was wilted and he didn't learn from that, and God gave him his wilted arm back, but he was too stubborn to listen to God, and eventually his entire line was wiped out, even though if he had followed God, he had the promise that his line would continue.
Right. What a great summary of the pattern that we're going to see with these kings, right? So like God gives them these chances. We talked about how God is pursuing them. He's looking for opportunities to correct and to draw them back, and they don't listen. And then there's these prophetic curses against their line for their not listening. And so we see this pattern in the northern kingdom. Like there's Jeroboam, and then his son takes over, and then there's a coup. And then there's Baasha, and then his son takes over, and then there's a coup. So we have this repetition from these kings that God says, I gave you a chance, but you won't walk in my ways. And so he removes them and tries someone else. And as we're coming into our section today, we're with the king Omri and his son Ahab. So if we were going to say like, oh, this is the pattern, Omri has a nice long reign, but he squanders it by doing evil, not walking in the ways of the Lord, and then his son takes over, what would we expect for the length of Ahab's reign?
That he would be better, but he's the worst.
Right. Well, so if he repented, then we would see kind of this pattern that Asa has, where he's coming out of that, right? But he does not repent. And so what we would expect is if we were going to have that long reign of the father, short reign of the son, and then coup, then what would happen at the beginning of Ahab's reign?
Everybody would be killed.
Yeah, there would be a coup. That line would be destroyed. God would raise up another. So maybe as we're coming into the story of Ahab's reign as readers, we're thinking like, oh, here's the pattern. This is what we would expect, right? But as we begin chapter 16 and we're seeing what God does, 17, we're up to 17. Or the end of chapter 16, the beginning of chapter 17, we see that God does not follow that pattern, right? He's going to break that pattern and do something different. Okay, let's look at the passage at the end of chapter 16. So turn over to 16, 29 through 33. Okay, we read this for last week, but this is when we meet Ahab. So we have this surprise. How many years does Ahab reign?
21 years.
Yeah, or 22, depending on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you may. I don't know that some translations have a different number. Numbers are quite notoriously hard to translate in Hebrew, so we sometimes see different numbers. But yeah, so he has this 22-year reign, another long reign, not the pattern. God is going to try something new. Now, what evil, looking at those same verses, what extra evil does Ahab perpetrate? Like, what is he bringing into Israel?
Oh, idol
Perpetuate is the
worship.
word I was trying to say. Okay, idol worship.
He set up Asherah poles. He built a temple to Baal.
Right. So not only have they brought in Baal worship in like the small shrines, but he has actually built a temple to Baal in his capital of Samaria and added a Asherah pole. You remember Baal and Asherah are supposed to be consorts, right? A male and female god that are like together. And so it makes sense that the worship goes together. How did that come about?
Because he married Jezebel?
Okay, who was Jezebel?
Oh,
Daughter of the king of the Zidonians.
Right. So Sidon is a country that's just directly north of Israel. Tyre and Sidon is that area just above Israel on the coast of the Mediterranean. And why would he marry this specific person? Like, what might be in the ancient world? What are some reasons he might have married her?
To not war with them, to have a treaty with them. That's what they did. They married, the daughter of the king so that they would be friends. They wouldn't fight with each other.
Right. This is a diplomatic move very often to cement an alliance and increase your political power in the region, right? We saw Solomon do that over and over with all of his marriages. And so we see that Ahab is building kind of a coalition here by marrying the Sidonian princess. So we're having the repetition of some of those patterns of Solomon that brought out the problem. Now, the
She might have
father,
been very beautiful too.
say again.
Jezebel may have been very pretty and attractive too.
Yes, and wealth is attractive, position is attractive, and in a time where nutrition is going to be widely different between the haves and the have-nots. Someone who is well off is going to be this, have these beauty and other characteristics. Those are going to go together, aren't they? So great point. Jezebel is the daughter of Ethbaal. What do you notice about Ethbaal's name?
Baal.
Yeah, exactly. He is a king priest of Baal, and Baal worship is extremely prominent in the royal household of Tyre and Sidon. And so this idolatrous worship is a big part of the royal family. We know more about Ethbaal from other sources. And so as he marries her, it makes complete sense, right, that the idolatrous worship that they are so involved in as a royal family in Sidon they're going to bring them with them, right? So this is different, worse than the sin of Jeroboam. The golden calves are improper worship, but they probably represent Yahweh in some way. And yet, even though they show a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of God, this is switching gods altogether, right? Now, Baal worship is the official worship of the kingdom because he has built this temple in the capital, like switching over your official worship, although it was probably not entirely switching over, but adding to. Remember, they always wanted to add to other gods, and the kingdoms around them always thought in terms of adding more gods, not switching over, right? So I shouldn't really say it that way, but making Baal like the primary worship of the kingdom of Israel. Right? So we, if we're reading with a prophetic eye, this would like fill us with dread, right? This is terrible news that this is what has happened. Now, we're going to go, so we have introduced the reign of Ahab. Questions or comments on that? And then we're going to go into these stories that happened during Ahab's reign. But there is this one little verse in between that is stuck in, and that I think that we want to cover today. So Janelle, would you read for us 1634?
Okay. In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun.
All right. What is going on? What is this verse about, and why is it here?
It's child sacrifice, isn't it?
Well, it doesn't spell it out, but I think that's a very likely scenario here. Yes.
Wasn't that part of Baal worship?
Usually, some of the other gods were much more common to have a child sacrifice. But it was common to say like that if you're going to like rebuild a city that required a really big sacrifice. And so a child would be a very big sacrifice. Okay.
But
What else?
didn't God tell them not to rebuild Jericho after it was destroyed?
He did, right? We get this prophecy. Well, so what was Jericho? Someone give us a little background. What happened with Jericho?
It was one of the early battles when Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land.
And the walls came tumbling down.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the children of Israel had been wandering in the wilderness, waiting to begin the conquest of Canaan. Right? We talked about how the evil of the people of Canaan was so great that God was dealing with them as he's bringing a blessing for his children in. He's doing more than one thing, right? And the first conquest was Jericho, and it was this miraculous conquest where they walked around the city and they blew the trumpets, and through that, the power of the Lord, not through their military might, they conquered and were able to go into Jericho, right? And then Joshua says in front of the people, this is in Joshua 6:26 through 27. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Okay, so that was a small statement. It's easy to miss it in the dramatic story of Jericho. The walls come tumbling down, Rahab's escaping, all of that. But like, what are we seeing about what has happened between this time when the Israelites came in against the evil of Jericho and the time now?
They've forgotten some of their history.
Yes, which is such a big part of what they're asked to do in the law, is to remember their history. Yeah, great point. What else?
Either they've forgotten it or they just don't believe it anymore.
Okay.
Don't believe what God has told them.
Yeah, because, they were enemies against Canaan, and now what are they? They're kind of just being absorbed into Canaanite worship and culture, aren't they? And so that is the big transition that we're seeing represented here. Where's Heel from? This guy Heel who rebuilt Jericho. Where is he from?
Bethel.
Right. So Bethel.
Is he a king?
He might be like a city king version for the city. I mean, Ahab is king of the whole land, and Bethel is in Israel, but he may have some power in a city area or a smaller area. What was significant about Bethel? What do you guys remember about Bethel?
Seem to recall an altar perhaps built there. I can't connect anything else, but it appears more than once in Old Testament history.
It does. Any other memories of Bethel? So Bethel means house of God. Remember all the Beths. Every city that starts with Beth is house of, Bet something. So like Bethlehem is house of bread. Bethel is house of God. And Jacob named it that as he had his encounter with God. So, so many thousands of years before in the, or many hundreds of years before, not many thousands, in his encounter with God in the time of the patriarchs, right? And then what did Jeroboam put in Bethel? Okay, I said, yeah, you have to unmute. We can read your lips, kind of.
The idol, the golden calf.
Yeah, one of those golden calves was in Bethel because they were taking advantage of the religious history of the place to make it a more appealing place to send the people to worship. Remember, Jeroboam's trying to use that for his political advantage. So Bethel was supposed to be a place of holiness, but it has been corrupted. Right now, someone from Bethel is even rebuilding Jericho. He's even doing it at the cost of his sons, And so this statement that came from Joshua way back is now coming through, right? We're seeing it as like a prophecy that has now been fulfilled, right? Which is part of the theme of everything that's been going on in Kings, is that we're seeing these prophecies against the people who disobey God. Then God is faithful and these prophecies do come to pass, right? So even with just this little piece, we're getting these themes picked up of the reliability of the prophecy of God. Questions or comments on this? I think it can seem a little random until we look at how the themes tie in. But, once we think about Bethel and how much Bethel has fallen from holiness, and we think about the theme of true prophecy.
One of the things that surprises me in a way, when God promised Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation, and your descendants are going to be so many, and I'm going to give you a land. Abraham believed him, and the generations after him also believed that, and they held on, it seems anyway, they held on to that promise that some time or other they were going to have land, a land of their own. And so lo and behold, here they are in Egypt, and they're enslaved for however many 100 years that was, or whatever, how many generations. But seemingly they still held on to that promise. And then after they get into the land and get the land, it's like they forgot everything. They no longer either believed it or didn't want to believe it, or greed took over, or it seems like for so long they held on to that, just those little promises of a nation, to be a blessing to nations and to have your own land. And then all of a sudden, here they are, they've got it, and look what they did. Do we do the same thing? It's a puzzlement to me.
I think super point, and this is, to Mary's point, like part of what they were supposed to be doing in their festivals were remembrances, right? They were called remembrances to the Lord. Like they were supposed to be reviewing their history. They were supposed to be reliving in some ways the Exodus, the story of God's faithfulness to them and his rescue of them in the Exodus, and all of their review of their history and the readings of the law, like they were supposed to be reading the law during certain times. And so all of that was supposed to help them remember, right? And when they stop doing it, of course they don't remember. They don't have their own copies of the Bible. If they did, I'm not sure they would read them if they did, but of course they don't have their own copies. Instead, that was part of the worship of the Lord, right? So you make an excellent point for us. Like this is why we go back, we study, even if we've already, a lot of us have been studying for many years and we've studied these books, but we go back and we study them again. And as we do, God is so faithful to bring us new insights and new ideas and new applications as our lives change. The word continues to speak into our lives, doesn't it? Right. And so that review of the history, all the way back, the faithfulness of God, both for benefit and for negative consequence, right? That faithfulness of God keeps coming through.
And look at the remembrance that we have. Once a week, we remember our Lord. And you think the significance of all of that. It's surprising to me also that we don't spend more time on the Lord's Supper. We kind of do it the most efficient way, it seems like sometimes. And it's, yes, that's our period of time to remember all those things. And look what happens if we forget.
Right. That remembrance is so important, right? And we do, that's why it would be easy to let some of those little pieces go when we're separate for the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Like we're not together. It would be easy to let those go. But as we are, even in our own households, doing those remembrances, we know that that connects us to the body of the church all around the world. Go ahead.
Deanna, it seems to me that as the leaders, those people that could read and things like that, as they became further and further away from the word, it made it easier for those that couldn't read, or to be a part of it, to be less, faithful.
Yeah, and we really see that theme coming up, right? Like when we see Jeroboam, part of the condemnation of Jeroboam is that not just that he sinned, but that he caused Israel to sin, right? And we see this with Ahab, as Ahab leads people, he's leading them astray, right? Leading them towards Baal. And so, there comes a point in today's reading where Elijah says, there's nobody but me left. And God says, no, I have people left, but those people become few and far between because it's so difficult. And so that, we have our own opportunities to be leaders in our communities, to speak up, to say that the cup of water that we offer is in the name of Jesus. We do those things because saying them is a way of connecting ourselves and each other back to Jesus Christ. Great point. Janelle.
I'm thinking about the elders, leaders you're talking about. I'm thinking about the elders. I'm thinking about people who have experienced things, who were there. They died off. They obviously lost, some things were lost as when they died off, because the younger ones who came up, they didn't have the same knowledge. They didn't have the same history, and they forgot it. And this kept, one generation and then another generation and then another one. It's like before long, it's like it's all gone.
Yeah. Anne.
Oh, I just wanted to share something, a little footnote that I read a moment ago that I thought was interesting about Ahab. Now I'm lost where it was. It says the names of Ahab's sons, Ahaziah, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, means the Lord grasps, and Joram, the Lord is exalted, suggests that Ahab did not intend to replace the worship of the Lord with the worship of Baal, but to worship both deities in a syncretistic way. I thought that was kind of an interesting point. Maybe he didn't have that intention all along, but was overcome. I mean, he had this wife that is notorious, so maybe it just kind of evolved that way. But I thought that was just an interesting note.
Yeah, and we see that pattern, right? That's a pattern that we see where that people think, and we can see it in our hearts, right? That we can just add in some other top priorities. Yes, God is the top priority, but let's add some more top priorities. And it's a theme throughout the Old Testament and even in the New. The idea of like, well, if this is a God, can he be an extra God, right? And it's a call to examine our hearts and say, how am I trying to have a bunch of top priorities.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I think that this is, even though we haven't covered as much of the chapters as like we're kind of covering this section, and because these are the themes of this whole section, aren't they? But let's go back and read some specific pieces. Read 17 verses 1 through 6.
Okay. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook.
Okay. So we have met Ahab, right? We've seen the pattern of prophecies against households that disobey God is faithful, and then maybe we're expecting a prophecy against the house of Omri or the house of Ahab, or even if the pattern of the golden calves follows, even maybe against the altar or the temple that was built in Samaria. But instead, we get this prophecy of drought, right? So to understand what's happening here, we have to think about who Baal is, right? Baal is a god of what? Does anyone happen to know that?
Rain.
Yeah, rain, storms, hilltops. Yeah, the fertility that comes from rain. And the mythology of Baal had him, the explanation of cycles of drought was that Baal had to periodically submit to the god Mot, the god of death. And he would die under the power of Mot, and the drought would happen, and he would later revive to again water the earth. So if there's no rain, what does that say about Baal?
Dead.
He's
No
dead,
control.
right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. So Elijah here is challenging this view of reality, right? How does he describe God? As the Lord, the God of Israel,
Lives.
right? So he says that the one true God can, while living, this isn't a result of him dying, his periodic death, right? But he can, while living, control the dew and the rain. So Baal can't do that, and he can't stop God from doing it. So we're starting to see that God, instead of addressing like the house of Ahab, the house of Omri, the house of Ahab, or the temple in Samaria first, God is going to address the Baal worship with the people as a whole, right? So the whole land he's going to speak into with this prophecy, he's going to speak into this Baal worship situation and say, like, who do you think Baal is? Who do you think I am? So all this whole section is about that. Now, verse 2, where does Elijah go? What's he doing?
He's hiding.
Yeah, he's hiding. He's hidden from Ahab, and because of the drought, he's east of the Jordan. He's out in the wilderness, right? He would normally starve, but what does God do?
Meat and bread.
Meat and bread, right? Morning and night. What does this echo? What does this remind us of?
Manna.
Okay,
Quail.
manna and quail, right? The feeding, the provision of the people in the wilderness, right? He's in the wilderness and God provides, right? God controls not just the rain, but the whole natural order. How does Elijah get his bread and meat?
Yeah, I have a note about that. It came from ravens. but ravens ate carrion, dead
Right,
meat,
right.
which is really weird for Jews.
But somehow God is having him bring good to eat food, right? Food that sustains him. He's sustained by that. Oh, Sandy, that your mute button is malfunctioning a little bit. I keep not hearing you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no.
It's showing that it's muted, but it's unmuted. Okay. Anyway, he was drinking from the brook for water. So.
Yeah, yeah. And so a brook in a drought is going to naturally do what?
Dry up.
Dry up. So even though this brook is going to dry up, is this a sign of God failing Elijah? Instead, this is a sign of God's power, that the thing that he has done has come to pass. And so then we see the next round of provision. Let's read 7 through 16, please.
Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah.
Thank you. Okay, what do y'all notice? What stands out to you?
Instead of an echo, this is kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus feeding the multitudes.
Ah, yes, yeah. We'll get another one on this too, don't we? Yeah, definitely. This multiplication. What else?
It's always interesting, I think, to see how close the New Testament is with the Old. When you look at God feeding his people in the wilderness, and then he's feeding Elijah in the wilderness, and Jesus feeds the 5,000. They're out in the boonies. And then in one of those feedings of Jesus, by Jesus, when he talks to the disciples, he says, "Didn't you understand the feeding of the 5,000 or whatever?" And it always crossed my mind, how do you understand a miracle? Why was that so puzzling? Didn't you understand it? And it has to, I would think anyway, cross your mind when you read that. Well, that's exactly what God does. He feeds his people in the wilderness. He provides for them when all it looks like it's lost. We just got to keep on keeping on believing in that.
Yeah, the Lord provides. Joyce, let me try and unmute you. Oh, it's going to make you do it.
The woman had such faith in and did what Elijah told her. if you didn't have any more than just a little bit for you and a little bit for your son, and you then Elijah said, give it to me first.
First, yes.
And that would leave her with not any bread for her and the son. So that is true belief, I think.
Yeah, and notice how she talks about God. What word does she use? As the Lord your God lives, right? There's this repetition of the words of live and die. She says, we're going to eat it and die, but the Lord your God lives. And so she makes a choice to trust the God who lives rather than the God who dies, right? She makes a choice to submit her living and dying to the power of the God who lives. Right? And where
But it
are
says,
they? Go ahead.
it says that I have commanded a widow. God says, I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you. So
Right.
he commanded her to do that. She didn't just dream it up.
But I'm not sure she knew it yet. Right? Like sometimes God's commands to us take us a while for us to grow into hearing. Yeah. Where are they? What's the significance of their location? You know, when Jesus talks about this story, he says, I tell you the truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months and a great famine came over all the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath.
Isn't that the hometown of Jezebel?
It's in the middle of Tyre and Sidon.
Exactly, right? So they're not in Israel. They are in Sidon. Who should be most powerful in Sidon if we subscribe to the understanding of like these regional powers of gods?
Ahab.
No, Baal would be the god.
Right. So this is Baal's territory. This is the land of Baal's power, right? They've gone to the home territory of the supposed power of Baal, right? And supposedly, if the idea of like the home territory idea were true, then Yahweh would be less powerful there. And so the way this is structured, God sends him there, to show his power over everywhere, right? It's not regional. If you're following along on who's following along on the First Samuel lessons that mentioned the others have been doing, right? This idea that like God is powerful in his place and like Dagon is powerful in his place, and like, but God never settles for that. He never wants he always is jealous to say like, no, my glory fills all the earth, right? So we have God acting powerfully in Baal's territory, right? We have the living God versus the God who dies. And now, God can save them from death and he can overcome the threat of death, but does God really have power over death, right? So that brings us into the next section. Read 17 through 24 for us.
Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him into the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the bed 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth."
Thank you. Okay, so the border between Israel and Sidon cannot stop God. And now what other border cannot stop God?
Death,
Life
Death.
and death.
life and death, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. God's power is supreme over even life and death. And we see that even after death has taken someone, it has no power against the power of the living God. Yeah. What else do y'all notice?
It seems like, after he had done the first part of continuing her food, and all, that she still apparently was not fully convinced that he was the man of God until he actually asked God to bring the son back.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? What were you saying, Dia?
I was just noticing that she was slow to believe. Here
Well,
she is having all this food, the flour and the oil, and yet her faith was maybe growing, but it wasn't as much as when Elisha cured the Lord cured her son.
yeah. Well, and I don't care if there's enough flour and oil if my son is not going to live to eat it. I don't, it's the scale of the tragedy that reached her was very great, right? And so in the face of that, she says, "Have you come to remind me of my sin?" So we have such a point of humility here, right? We get, it's a what did you call it? A precursor, or not, instead of an echo, a foreshadowing, when we have women like the Syrophoenician woman who says, "But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table," right? Just this idea that, like, yes, I'm sinful, but can you help me? And so we have this cry from help. And at the end, Elijah's credentials are proven, right? This is how the text frames it, is that now we know Elijah is the man of God. He has been authenticated by these happenings. And why is that going to matter going into the next chapter?
Is it because he's supposed to go back to Ahab and talk with him again?
Yes, and he's going to set up this contest, right? So let's let the reader know that Elijah does indeed speak for the Lord, right? We see this all through even the Gospels. We'll see, or in Acts, when we studied in Acts, we saw, Peter is authenticated by the healings that he does in the name of Jesus immediately before he testifies about the Spirit bringing him to Cornelius, right? He's authenticated before the Lord does something with him. And so we see that pattern here as well, right? All right, chapter 18. So this is hopefully a familiar story because we're not going to be able to read it, but in class. But what has Ahab been doing this whole time during the drought? Verse 10.
He's in hiding from Jezebel, basically.
Who's in hiding?
Elijah.
Yes. And so what has Ahab been doing? The king Ahab.
He's been killing the prophets.
Okay. What's he doing with respect to Elijah? Look at verse 10, 18:10.
Searching for him.
Yes. Where has he been searching?
Everywhere.
Yeah, he goes to, right? All these other kingdoms, he makes them swear that they could not find him. Like he has been pulling in all his political weight to try to find Ahab, but he can't because Ahab is under the power and protection of the Lord, right? This is a divine sort of hiding of Elijah and protection of Elijah during this time. What does, in verse 17, when he finally meets him, what does Ahab call Elijah?
Troubler of Israel.
Troubler of Israel, right. This is the same word that we see used in another Joshua story. So you remember when they did Jericho and then Ai, as they conquered those cities, they were supposed to be devoting all of the plunder to the Lord, right? And you may remember there was one man, Achan, who secretly took some of that plunder from himself. And they go on a search for the troubler of Israel. In Joshua 7:25, as they discover that it was actually Achan, 7:25 says, Joshua said, "Why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day." And all Israel stoned them with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. And so there's this idea that the troubler of Israel is the one who brings the Lord's wrath, right? The one who does the wrong thing, disobeys God, and therefore brings the wrath of the Lord. And so what is Ahab accusing Elijah of?
Causing the drought.
Yeah, maybe you're the problem. Maybe, you're the one who said there's a drought. Maybe you're causing the drought by your whatever, something, right? And what does Elijah respond here in 18?
He says it was your family that caused all the trouble, not me.
Right? Who's the troubler of Israel, right? This is kind of thematic for the whole section, right? What is causing the problem? Is it the Lord or is it Baal? Is it Elijah bringing this word, or is it Ahab with his behavior that's not walking in the ways of the Lord, right?
Their trouble was more than a drought.
Yes, go on, say more about that. What is their true trouble?
Their lack of belief, their unbelief.
Yeah, their disobedience to God, right? He says, you're the problem. It's all about you who's disobeying God and bringing God's wrath. And so Elijah conducts his contest, right? He says, verse 21, he went before the people and said, "How long will you limp?" This word is literally limp, like a walking with a limp, between two opinions. So instead of walking in the ways of the Lord, they are limping along between these two ideas. And he conducts this contest, right? He proposes a contest. He says, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Well, we find out later he's not the only one left, but they're in hiding, right? And so they go to a hilltop. A hilltop would be Baal's territory, right? Baal has the advantage in the number of prophets. So in this sort of transactional understanding of a god gets power by worship that empowers them. And so all of these prophets are going to be there empowering Baal with their worship, like sending up worship that strengthens Baal. And Elijah is just there alone, right? So if we look at the way the contest happens, it's so different, right? The Baal worshipers are trying to do all the things, right? They're going to, just like the people in 1 Samuel with the Ark of the Lord, that they're going to make God do what they want by completing these rituals, right? Baal worship, they're trying to do the things they have to make their outcome be what they want it to be. But Elijah's is so simple. He just speaks to the Lord, right? The Lord answers. He says, whoever answers with fire, he is God. And at the time of the sacrifice, he says, God, let it be known that you are God in Israel. And so this simple prayer brings about the fire from heaven that consumes the sacrifice, the altar, and the water around it, right? It's this great victory for the name of the Lord, for the reputation of the Lord with the people, right? God is addressing Baal worship with the people. And then, you know, we've seen the story about how Elijah has these intense moments, and then he flees from Jezebel. He goes to the mountain, and out of that time, he has this encounter with the Lord. Questions before we go to that final encounter? We're going to run over, but we'll try to keep it to about 5 minutes. Out of that final encounter, we get 1 Kings 19, 13 through 18. Will you read that, please?
Okay.
Elijah is in the mount. Remember, Horeb is the mountain of God, and he's been hiding there. He's been provided provisions for this journey, and he's been looking for the word of the Lord. Go ahead.
Okay. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet." Let's see. Jehu will put to death. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him.
Thank you. Okay, so we finally come through the period where God is addressing the Baal worship of the people, and now he's come to address the house of Ahab, right? This anointing of Jehu is, you know, if you anoint someone king who's not the son of the current king, that you're saying that that dynasty is going to be removed and another is going to follow. It will take many, many chapters for us to go all the way through the story of Jehu, who will have complete the work of this prophecy, right? This is going to be over a very long time. But he is addressing each thing in its turn, right? God has shown that he is the living God, the one who is God in Israel. And he is making these times of prophecy be a focus for the people, right? There will even be a prophet to succeed Elijah, right? Prophets don't run in dynasties necessarily, usually, right? But God is, there's such an emphasis on this time of the Lord speaking and how he is reaching out to his people, and he still knows those who have not fallen away from him, those who are faithful. He knows every one of them, and he reserves them for himself. And so during this period of Israel, when the sin keeps escalating, God does not just keep escalating his consequences without providing a way back to himself. He makes this a time of him speaking, a time of intense prophetic activity, because he's pursuing his people. Right? This time of their hardship is also an opportunity for them to listen to his word and to listen to the truth that is spoken by this authenticated people. He's gone to the trouble to authenticate his prophets so that they will know who to listen to and continue to try to reach out, to bring back, to pursue his people. Out of his great love and his great faithfulness. So we're going to see these prophecies happen over the next many lessons, several lessons, because these are long terms. God is a God of history, and we see his work over time as part of that story. All right, next week, we are going to read more about Ahab. I've called that lesson Ahab's Bad Decisions, and we'll cover 1 Kings 20 through 22. And that'll kind of, follow up on the story of Ahab and Israel. And after that, we'll switch back to Judah. Thank you all for being here.
Just a quick, don't you think it must have been very difficult for believers to be in the area where Ahab, it would almost be like they would have to be in hiding all the time.
Yes, and we saw that if you read the parts that we didn't read, he's like, I've been hiding these prophets and providing them bread and water. That this was a great time of hardship for anyone who was faithful to God.
Right, because you think of the women and men, they weren't all prophets, but just the followers.
Right, those who have not bowed a knee, and God knows everyone. He knows each one. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. This is wonderful. If all of you saw your newsletter from Linda, it had a little blurb about